I'd like to just give a couple of more examples of switching costs. The remarks that I was making before were just reminding you that customers are generally aware of what those switching costs are, but sometimes they're not. Let's just consider a couple of examples in which the firm is selling a product that you call addictive in some sense. So if the buyer starts using it, it's going to be very difficult to stop. Classic example, of course, is cigarettes. And if you want to get people starting to smoke, the best way to do it is to market those cigarettes to children, because of course they don't really understand how difficult it will be to stop smoking. Last year I read a good report in The Guardian, the British newspaper online, which reported on an international study that was done across a variety of different countries. And just to give you an example, in New Delhi, in India, researchers saw, quoting here, single cigarettes and tiny sachets or little bundles of chewing tobacco for sale alongside sweets directly opposite school gates, which of course is in violation of the law in India, but the law was not being enforced. If you're interested in the details, you can go to that particular website there. Another example is infant formula. Maybe not something that you would think of, but what companies do is they give away free samples of the product to new customers, in this case, mothers who've just given birth. And if they make the mistake of using this infant formula, their breast milk is going to dry up, and then they'll have nothing to feed their babies. They'll have no substitute, and the customers are effectively hooked. So, again, from The Guardian, I saw a report on an investigation in the Philippines, which said, just quoting here, many women were found to be spending up to 3/4 of their income on formula for their babies, sometimes denying themselves food to afford it. So this infant formula is very expensive for people in a poor country like the Philippines. And so once they get hooked on it, then once they have, in fact, no other substitute, then in order to keep their baby alive, or to try to at least, they have to buy the product. Of course, what ends up happening often is that the infant formula ends up being diluted, often with contaminated water. The babies get sick and die. So these companies are quite successful in increasing their profits by killing infants. I might just add that that same report that was in The Guardian described how the infant formula companies were everywhere in the hospitals handing out their marketing pamphlets, bribing doctors and medical personnel, and doing everything that they could to sell their product. Well, let's consider what would happen if all sellers were quite successful in creating high switching costs. Well, that would be a situation in which we could describe the market as being segmented. So in other words, it's divided up into segments or parts so that each firm has a pool of its own customers who stick with it. And perhaps you could have a small group of customers who might move around between one firm or another. But each firm has kind of a group of captive customers, you might say. In that situation, every firm's demand becomes less elastic or more price inelastic. And that would mean, if you think about it, that if each firm, if just one firm were to reduce its price, it's not going to be very successful in attracting customers from other firms because their demand is relatively elastic, and that's going to mean that a given percentage reduction in price is not going to result in a very large increase in quantity demanded. That would mean that cutting prices is not going to be very attractive. We'll see a little bit later in the course that firms would, in general, like to avoid price competition and price cutting. So if they were successful in creating these kinds of high switching costs for their customers, then that would reduce the chances of a destructive price war, for example. Another way of dealing with the threat of substitutes is to tie products together. So tying involves the idea that if you use one product, you really must use another. It really eliminates the idea of substitutes entirely. The classic example, which is discussed in your text, is the case of printers and printer cartridges. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this problem. So once you buy a printer, you're pretty well stuck having to get a particular kind of cartridge that's going to fit into that printer. We'll come back to this example later when we think about how you'd want to price the printer and the cartridges. There are lots of other examples in which goods are tied together like this. One that occurs to me is certain kinds of cameras that require a particular kind of film. Polaroid cameras are an obvious example. There are lots of other examples in which you have products that are tied. So, for example, if you have a particular make of car and you need a replacement part for it, some parts may be kind of generic. Lots of producers produce substitutes, but some of those products might be specific to that make and model of the car. And of course, those things are going to be quite expensive. Okay, let's just summarize the strategies that we've seen here. How to deal with the threat of substitutes. We've looked at the idea of product differentiation and have divided that into two different kinds of processes, a static one and a dynamic one, in which products are continually changing over time. We can think of customer switching costs, costs of switching both away from our product and towards our product. And it's not going to be possible with all goods, but it's possible to tie the product to some complementary good, which also has to be purchased. So if the firm is producing both of those products, it may be able to enhance its profits by creating a complementary good or a tied good that the customer then has to buy. But of course, the customer is again going to be aware of the switching costs that are involved. So, for example, if you think about buying a printer, the printer may be cheap, may look very attractive, but you would probably be wise to check into the prices of the cartridges.